The release of Apple's new M1 chip brought with it a host of compact and powerful devices. For us as users, this is great news because even entry-level machines like the M1 Mac Mini provide more power and efficiency than we've ever been able to get at this price point. But since small, light, and less expensive devices like the M1 MacBook Air offer this new chip, is there still a reason for the average user to get the new MacBook Pro? And if you're a professional, I think there are some important limitations that you should be aware of before buying. What's up, Sagi here, and welcome to another Tech Gear Talk. Today we're going to take a look at the brand new M1 MacBook Pro and talk about whether it's a good value for a user who's looking for a powerful, compact, light, and capable laptop. Someone who wants a little more than the MacBook Air can offer and is looking for a device that will last them for at least the next 4 to 5 years. Let's talk about the features and benefits, what advantages you get over the MacBook Air, which configuration options you should consider, and I'll also mention some areas where I think Apple could have done a little more. If you don't have a ton of experience with the Apple notebook ecosystem, let me tell you a little bit about the MacBook Pro. And if you're very familiar with this current lineup, I have the video broken down into chapters. The MacBook Pro is Apple's higher-end notebook, and it offers features like TOUCHBAR, active cooling, a brighter display, better speakers, and better battery life than the MacBook Air. Of course, if portability is not a requirement, you should check out the new M1 Mac Mini. So the MacBook Pro has the same form factor as the previous model at 8.36 inches by 11.97, which is approximately 21 by 30 centimeters, and it's 0.61 inches or 1.56 centimeters in height. This is very similar to the 2020 12.9-inch iPad Pro, which you may also be looking at, and I'll have a comparison of the two up very soon. If we're comparing this to the 2020 Intel version of the MacBook Pro, then we're getting the new M1 chip and improved battery life, and at the same time we're losing the option for 4 ports, but I'll talk about this more later. Now, like the M1 Mac Mini and the MacBook Air, the MacBook Pro can be upgraded to 16 gigabytes of RAM and all the way up to 2 terabytes of SSD, which gives us a very powerful notebook with sustained performance due to the active cooling, fast graphics, a powerful neural engine, a beautiful bright display, a versatile touch bar, Touch ID, and a good set of speakers. All of this starting at $12.99. Now, speaking of the display, it's a 13.3-inch IPS Retina display like with the previous models, and it sports the same 2560 by 1600 resolution and 500 nits of brightness. We're getting a wide color gamut, a DCI-P3 for more accurate color reproduction, and an advantage over the 2016 MacBook Pro is that the new version uses True Tone technology, where sensors are able to detect the ambient color temperature of your environment, and they allow the MacBook Pro to adjust the display to where white always appears to be white rather than yellow or blue. Now, as far as display, if you have a relatively recent version of the MacBook Pro, then the only real upgrade for you is the True Tone technology. For me, this wouldn't be much of a reason to upgrade. An important upgrade to this year's MacBook Pro was the keyboard. For the most part, the reason why I would choose a laptop over a tablet is the keyboard. I actually spent years of computer work undervaluing a good keyboard simply because I hadn't experienced one. Now that I've been using mechanical keyboards for years, it's definitely something that I appreciate and there's no going back. Now, the MacBook Pro has a new backlit Magic Keyboard with redesigned scissor switches. The keys have more travel and they provide feedback to help my hand avoid getting fatigued when typing for hours. And this could be the best keyboard that I've ever typed on a notebook. Like, it's actually really that good. There's plenty of space between the keys. It's just extremely comfortable to type on. As far as the arrow keys, we're getting an inverted T configuration, and the board also has an ambient light sensor, which will help you type in low light settings. On the top right, you'll see the Touch ID sensor, which you can use to unlock the MacBook Pro, complete purchases, and access secure documents or system settings, all without having to enter a password. And this is something that I've grown accustomed to with my iPhone and my iPads, and I'm glad that this improved user experience continues to my laptop. At the top of the board, you'll see the touch bar, which personally I love. I know that some people prefer the function keys, but for me, the fact that this automatically changes functionality based on what I'm doing, it knows what app I'm in, and it gives me either suggestions or the most used shortcuts for that specific app, provides a better user experience. And I much prefer prefer the visual aspect of what each button is going to do rather than having to remember what I programmed the function button for. Now moving on to the bottom of the board, we have an awesome Force Touch trackpad, which is large, it's precise, it makes it very comfortable for everyday functions like swiping, pinching, and zooming. In addition to the traditional operation, we're also getting all of the enhanced force click functionality, which I'll cover in a dedicated video. Now the trackpad feels clicky, but it actually doesn't move when you press on it, and instead it uses haptic feedback to simulate a click. All in all, this is at the top of my list of favorite trackpads to use, and it's something that I now expect from Apple devices. And moving on to another major upgrade when compared with the Intel versions of the 2020 MacBook Pro, we have to discuss the battery life. I briefly mentioned the M1 chip, and we'll get to the processing power in a later section, but probably the most impressive aspect of this new SoC or system on chip design is efficiency. Now Apple reports 20 hours of battery life on the M1 MacBook Pro, which is twice that of the Intel versions with the same size 58.2 watt-hour battery. As I used and tested my MacBook Pro, I easily finished every day with plenty of battery power left. It got to the point where I stopped bringing the dedicated charger with me because I felt confident enough that I wouldn't need it. When it does come to charging, the MacBook Pro comes with a 61 watt USB-C power adapter versus something like the 30 watt adapter that comes with the MacBook Air. So that should let the MacBook Pro charge faster, and it's something that I'll discuss in the comparison. Now next, let's take a look at connectivity, starting with the available ports. We're getting 2 Thunderbolt USB 4 ports, which offer extremely high bandwidth and a lot of versatility. You can transfer data, charge the MacBook Pro, and output 6K video to an external display. Now, I think this is definitely an area where Apple should have done more. Unlike the MacBook Air, this is a Pro device, and I would have liked to see it come standard with 4 ports, or at least have that offered as a paid option. Also, I wish they weren't on the same side, so even if there were only 2, you could get 1 on each side, and that way I'd be able to charge the MacBook Pro from either directions. Now, I'm used to working with a USB-C hub, so it's now an accessory that I always have with me. But since this is a device targeted at a more demanding user, I think having 4 ports would have been a great way to differentiate it from the MacBook Air. Now, another limitation that some users will notice is that there's only support for 1 external display. So if you have dual monitors, you'll feel left out. And there are some workarounds available which aren't currently supported by Apple, so hopefully this is something that Apple can address. And there's also no support for external GPUs. Now, for the average user, this isn't going to matter, but if that's something that you previously counted on, I wanted you to be aware. And if you're still looking for those features, the Intel-powered MacBook Pro is still a better option for you. As far as wireless connectivity, we have upgrades in both Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. We're now getting the newer and faster Wi-Fi 6, which helps maintain the faster speeds, especially when you load your network with more and more devices. Plus, we have the upgraded Bluetooth 5.0 instead of 4.0 on the previous model. Now, moving on to audio features, the M1 MacBook Pro has stereo speakers with high dynamic range wide stereo sound. Now, these sound very good for laptop speakers, so if you regularly use your laptop to view content while listening to the built-in speakers, you'll be very happy. I almost always use my AirPods or whatever headphones or speakers I'm testing, so the quality of the speakers, while impressive, isn't a huge deal for me. For a mic, the MacBook Pro has what Apple calls a studio quality 3-mic array with high signal-to-noise ratio and bidirectional beamforming. Now, I'm not sure what studio quality means per se, but this mic is really impressive. I did a comparison with the iPad Pro, and I definitely like the mic on the MacBook Pro better. It will be plenty good for your video calls, and of course, if you want even more professional audio, you'll always want to use some type of external microphone. Now, the camera on the MacBook Pro is unfortunately still a 720p FaceTime high-def camera, so we're not getting an upgrade in resolution. I'd at least like to see 1080p, and more than that, just a better camera, as most professionals are having to do so many more video calls. At least the M1 chip's image signal processor improves the performance of the camera significantly. So if you're coming from an older model, you'll definitely notice a difference. Now, coming from the iPad Air 4, iPad Pro, the iPhone 12 and 12 Pro, I definitely noticed the difference in quality. I mean, those devices are just better than the MacBook Pro. As a casual user, I would just use those devices for a Zoom call, but in a professional setting where I want to multitask and share my screen, I would rather use a laptop. Now, I'm fairly used to less than great webcam quality on laptops, but this was another opportunity to differentiate the MacBook Pro from the MacBook Air. Now, as always, regardless of the camera that you're using, if you want improved video quality for calls, focus on improving your lighting. As far as setup and more credit to the M1 chip, the MacBook Pro came to life almost instantly. There's something satisfying about fast boot times. Like, it may only be a few seconds, but it just seems like you're getting the work faster. Now, the setup itself is super simple. If you're new to macOS, just follow the steps and you should be up and running very quickly. If you've got an existing Apple device and you're porting over files and apps, then you're looking at a little more time depending on your transfer speed. Either way, the process is quick and easy, and you won't be sitting around for long before you're playing around with your new MacBook Pro. Now, before I move on to the configuration options and which one you should get, if you like what you've seen so far and have gotten value from this video, let me know by giving it a thumbs up. It helps the video and the channel, and it lets me know what kind of content you like so that I can make more of it. And if it's your first time here, hit the subscribe and notification buttons so you can stay up to date on all the latest Apple gear and tutorials. All right, so now let's talk about the available MacBook Pro configuration options and see which one is right for you. My approach with this device is a little different than with the Mac Mini and the MacBook Air because I think the target audience is different. Having said that, there is a similar consideration. Like the M1 Mac Mini and the MacBook Air, the MacBook Pro is not upgradable in any way. So what you buy is what you'll have for as long as you own this notebook. So if you get the 8 gigs of RAM, and the 256 gigs of SSD storage, which is the base configuration, then you can invest in additional RAM or internal storage at a future date. Now, similarly to the Mac Mini, the first choice you have to make is about internal storage. The base configuration comes with 8 gigs of RAM and 256 gig SSD for $299. You can then upgrade to 512 gigs of internal storage for $14.99, 1 terabyte for $16.99, and then the max 2 terabytes for $2,099. And you'll notice that you're paying quite a premium for internal storage. Now, by comparison, you can add 2 terabytes of Samsung T7 for $250 and get even more total storage than the 2 terabyte MacBook Pro upgrade. It'll be fast, not as fast as the internal storage, but still fast. And it will mean that you'll need to carry an external SSD with you to access those files. I would at least get 512 gigs of internal storage because if you're buying a MacBook Pro instead of a MacBook Air, my assumption is that you'll be using it differently and you're likely to use apps that require more space. I also think that a lot of users who are buying this laptop are more likely to have higher internal storage needs over the next couple of years as developers take advantage of the processing power of the new M1 chip. My personal experience workflow revolves around external storage. So even at 2 terabytes, I wouldn't be able to fit even this year's video files. So I'm always going to be working off of an external SSD or my Synology disk station. Now, this is where I highly suggest you take a close look at your needs. If you could get by with 1 terabyte of internal storage and will have no need to carry an external SSD with you, while being more expensive, you are getting a lot of convenience. If you plan on relying on external storage regardless, get more internal storage than you currently need, but don't max it out because your money will be better spent elsewhere. Where, you might ask? Well, RAM, which is a bit of a pain point for me with this new MacBook Pro. The base configuration comes with 8 gigs of unified RAM, which Apple says creates a single pool of high bandwidth, low latency memory, which allows apps to efficiently share data between the CPU, GPU, and neural engine. And like I mentioned, this is not upgradable. So if you get 8 gigs, that's all you'll ever have. If you're getting a MacBook Pro, you'll want to upgrade to the 16 gig option. I know it's $200, but it'll be well worth it for the many years that I hope you use this device. There are apps, lots of apps that just love using your RAM, Chrome. And even if you don't think you need it right now, if you think you can get by with 8, I wouldn't recommend it. Just get to 16 gigs. I just have a tough time imagining that 5 years from now, you'll look back and think that it was more than what you needed. In fact, one of the opportunities for improvements that I would like to see with the MacBook Pro is the ability to upgrade to even more RAM, to 32 gigs. Because if I choose to buy this MacBook Pro, if I don't want to wait until the next model, but still want a device that will last for as long as possible, that is the one bottleneck that I can see coming back to haunt me. It's one of the only reasons why I would still consider an Intel-based MacBook Pro, along with additional ports, larger internal SSD options, and better non-native app compatibility. Now, the more RAM you have, the more apps you can run simultaneously, and the better they'll perform. If you're on a budget, if you have to choose between RAM and storage, spend it on RAM. You can always use external storage, even if it's a little bit less efficient, but there's nothing you could do if you don't have enough RAM. And I'll also say that if budget is that much of a concern, make sure that you actually need the MacBook Pro rather than the more affordable MacBook Air. Comparison coming soon. Now, moving on to performance, there are plenty of videos covering the impressive performance of the M1 chip. There are tests and benchmarks everywhere, so I'm going to skip those. Not because they're unimportant, but because they test very specific things in very controlled environments. But that's not the environment in which I work at. My normal workflow is rendering a video while having 42 tabs open in Chrome. Then what? Then how will this MacBook Pro do? Now, the M1 chip is impressive. In fact, very impressive. But no matter how efficient a chip may be, if you continue to push it hard enough, it's going to heat up. And if it heats up enough, it will have to throttle back performance. Unless, of course, we move beyond the passive cooling on the MacBook Air to the active cooling on the MacBook Pro. Enter the fan. This cooling fan, which rarely even comes on, allows the MacBook Pro to maintain high workloads like rendering 4K video. This single feature would be the reason why I would suggest that if you're a more demanding user, if you plan on regularly pushing your device, get the MacBook Pro. All right, so you're almost ready to get a MacBook Pro, but what else might you want? Now, before I get to my final thoughts, let me quickly talk about a few accessories that I recommend. I am putting together a full accessories video for the MacBook Pro, but this will give you a glimpse into a few of the important ones. I did mention that the trackpad on this notebook is really nice, but when I'm at my desk, I like to use a mouse. One of my favorite options right now is the Logitech MX Master 3 for Mac. I absolutely love this line of mice from Logitech, and I've been using them for over 10 years when I got my first Performance MX. I found that all the models are extremely comfortable, and with each iteration, Logitech introduces additional features. With one mouse, I can control my main workstation, the Mac Mini, and my MacBook Pro by simply clicking the button at the bottom to toggle between devices. Now next, I mentioned that I wish there were more ports, so I use a USB-C hub to expand the functionality by adding a couple of USB-A ports, SD and micro SD card readers, and an HDMI output for an external display. Now the third accessory that I would get right away is an external SSD. The two that I use right now are the SanDisk Extreme Pro and the Samsung T7. Both work great and are much more cost effective than the internal storage. Like I said, I'm finishing up a full accessories video where I'll include everything that I use to improve my user experience with the MacBook Pro, both when I'm at home and on the go. So if that's something that you're interested in, smash the subscribe and notification buttons. All right, so what's the verdict? Is this 2020 M1 MacBook Pro a device that I think will meet the needs of the target audience for the foreseeable future? We're getting a compact and light device, upgraded keyboard, speakers, and microphone, a beautiful and bright display, a touch bar and touch ID, a very capable processor, amazing battery life, and sustained performance with the help of active cooling. Go ahead and upgrade the RAM to 16 gigs. Get yourself at least 512 gigs of internal storage, more if you can afford it, and then supplement with external storage if budget is a concern. If you're looking for a powerful, efficient, and compact notebook, want more than what the MacBook Air can offer, and are looking for sustained performance, the M1 MacBook Pro is a good option for you. If you want more than 16 gigs of RAM, more built-in ports, support for multiple external monitors, external GPU support, and better non-native app compatibility, especially early on, then the Intel version of the MacBook Pro might be a better option for you. Finally, if you don't need portability at all, definitely check out the M1 Mac Mini, which is one of my favorite devices. All in all, I think the M1 MacBook Pro represents a good value for what you get if the opportunities for improvements don't hold you back. But I'd love to know what you think, so fill out that comment section. I'll put links in the description to where you can buy a MacBook Pro, as well as the accessories that I mentioned in this video. And I really hope I was able to give you a good overview of the M1 MacBook Pro. If I did, please let me know by giving this video a thumbs up. Tweet it, share it, and if you haven't yet, join the community by hitting the subscribe and notification buttons. You can always find me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Tech Gear Talk. You know what I always say, buy it nice or buy it twice. Good luck and see you soon.